This is the brand new DJI Action 5 Pro. And this is also the brand new GoPro Hero 13 Black. Both of these are the new kids on the block, and when you're looking at the highest end of action cameras, what DJI has to offer and what GoPro has to offer is kind of the peak. But as we get into these later generations of cameras, the 5th generation from DJI and the 13th from GoPro, the differentiators between them start to get smaller and smaller. And overall, both of these cameras are great, but they offer some key features in different areas that might make you want to choose one over the other. This is by far the biggest category in my opinion. When it comes to cameras like this and cameras this size, image quality is where they break down the fastest. You know, you can go into low lights and they just look terrible, or maybe they don't. We'll talk about that in a second. And they just kind of fall apart a lot easier than maybe, you know, like my C70. Obviously, that makes sense. But that's why comparing the image quality, I think, matters. And at the very least, it's what matters to me. So let's just jump into a comparison. Action 5 here and GoPro 13 here. And you can see me, I'm in a backlit situation with the sun in frame. You can check the dynamic range, what it looks like. Not only am I doing video testing, but this is also the microphone. So here is the Action 5 Pro, and now here is the GoPro Hero 13. I'll be switching between them. You'll see it on screen there, so you can, you know, see how they sound. This type of situation is probably, you know, the best case scenario for action cameras. There's a ton of light. Yeah, I'm being backlit, but they usually handle shadows and, you know, this type of situation pretty well. By the way, these are both in the highest settings possible. So we're getting all the dynamic range out of the 5 Pro, and we're getting all of that dynamic range out of the 13 as well. But even though this situation is, you know, pretty standard for a camera like this, when we go into lower light situations or more typical, you know, day-to-day use situations, that's where you can really see how these differ. When looking at these images on screen, I mean, you be the judge here, but to my eye, it is clear that the Action 5 Pro has significantly better dynamic range and just overall better image quality, especially if we look at these lower light situations, which is an area that these action cameras typically struggle in. The Action 5 Pro is actually holding its own, and it looks pretty usable, whereas the GoPro, it just plain struggles. Now, while the way the image looks, I think, is very, very important, the specs behind it do matter and can help you capture certain things. And here, I think the GoPro has a bit of an edge. It's rocking a 5.3K sensor, and it can do that with an 8:7 aspect ratio. You can get kind of more closer to a square format. So if you're doing a lot of vertical video and horizontal video, it's easy to switch between both. So you can just see it here. I can go from horizontal for YouTube, and I can switch it to vertical easily, and I'm just losing less of that frame. I can kind of film easier for both. I really like that, and I wish that was something the Action 5 had, because it would be what I'm using all the time. The Action 5 Pro, on the other hand, can only go up to 4K 120, but that is also something that the GoPro can do. It can also do 4K 120. And the slow motion options, I think, are a little bit better on the GoPro. They're pretty even, but it maybe edges it out a bit. You can see all the different modes here. They both work effectively, but, you know, it just depends on what exact feature you're looking for. But even with those spec differences, if I had to choose a camera based strictly on what I see on my screen and how that footage is to manipulate and use, I'm picking up the DJI Action 5 every single time. At first glance, it would seem the hardware on both of these cameras has not changed much at all in the last few years, but if you bring out some of the older cameras and put them next to it, you can see all the changes that have been made, and they lead to both being really excellent pieces of hardware. And this is one area that I think DJI really focused on with this year's camera, because built in, there are a few hardware features that are just plain useful to have. Not necessary, but just nice. The biggest difference when looking at the hardware on both of these is the screen and screen quality. The Action 5 Pro now features dual OLED displays that are both touchscreen, both on the front and back, whereas the GoPro is the same old LCD, which is only a touchscreen on the back, not on the front. And just putting them side by side, it is a huge difference. Now, these screens overall are still very small and not the most useful when it comes to, you know, seeing what your image is actually going to look like. They're still
very small displays. But when it comes to going through menus, changing settings, the Action 5 just has GoPro beat here. And it's one area that I'd love to see GoPro improve, because the screen has not really changed much since they've added that front display. And not only the quality, but I feel the touch sensitivity is not all that good, whereas on the Action 5, it feels just like a smartphone. So that is great. And another thing DJI built in is support for DJI Mic 2. So now that can be a receiver for 2 different transmitters, and this is great. Now GoPro can also do this. It can accept audio from external receivers. It doesn't have to be DJI Mic 2, but that is part of the options. But the sound quality is just not nearly as good. Now, where DJI decided to build in some of those features, GoPro this year instead seemed to focus on the accessories that they're bringing over. So now there's a bunch of different lens mods that you can add that change how the camera films. So there is a macro lens, which lets you film really close, which is always an issue with these cameras. There's different ND filters that are automatically detected by the camera, so you don't have to change that setting. There's an ultra wide mod to get an even wider field of view, and there is a anamorphic mod coming soon that should give you a little bit more of a cinematic field of view. Personally, I haven't been able to use those yet, but it's nice that they are options, although they do cost more money. But there are other options here too, like being able to use a magnetic door and power cable kit so that you can magnetically, it's kind of like MagSafe for your camera. You can just charge it with a magnet. That's pretty nice. And there's also a new mount option that I'm so happy GoPro finally has, and they actually are now the king of mounts. Now on the bottom here, they have the prongs, which you are used to, that are just folded away. There's a 1/4 thread as well. We've had that since last year, but now it also works with a magnetic mount, which is what DJI came out with a few years ago. Now it has all the options, whereas DJI only has the magnetic mount built in, and it doesn't have a 1/4 or those prongs. So I'd like to see the Action 5, or I guess Action 6, have that built in. That makes GoPro really convenient for mounting. The last thing is battery life. Both of these cameras have new batteries this year, but one advantage is that the Action 5 Pro is the exact same shape battery as last year's camera. So if you had that, you are still able to use those batteries, even though there's slightly less capacity, but they do work if you are in a pinch. Whereas the GoPro is the same size battery, but the prongs are in a different location, so you're not able to use your old batteries. That's a big bummer, because I know a lot of people that don't necessarily get rid of their old camera. They just upgrade and use them both together. That's something I do, at least. But now that means I have 2 sets of batteries I have to think about. That's a bummer. But when it comes to actual battery life, I find both of them to be decent in like real world use, although the Action 5 is significantly longer, at least in my opinion, and it has fast charging up to 80%. So it's just a much more smartphone-like experience, if that makes sense. And DJI also has 47 gigabytes of usable internal storage built into the camera, so you don't need a micro SD card if you don't want, although you can use that. Whew, that has saved me a few times already, just when I go out and forget to put my SD card in here, and I don't really need it. I can just record right to the camera. That is a big bonus. So with all of that in mind, the 13 Black is $399, whereas the Action 5 Pro is $349. So you're saving about $50 between them, and well, that seems like a pretty good deal.
We are now at the point where both of these cameras are going to give you excellent results. We're past the point of any of these really like being bad, which is good, because that means you can kind of buy whichever one fits you best and you're gonna get a good result. Now, honestly, we're kind of talking about splitting hairs. You have to decide what is most important to you. Do you have DJI mics that you would love to connect, and you already have those? So of course, the DJI Action 5 would make more sense. Or do you already have an editing workflow for color grading GoPro footage? Then it would just make sense to upgrade to the 13. These are all those little details that will really make or break this camera for you, and you just kind of have to go through and decide which one is for you. For me personally, I'm in the DJI ecosystem. I love the image that I get out of the Action 5 Pro with that dynamic range and, you know, color grading ability. And I've also personally just had less issues with the physical hardware on the DJI side, where in past the GoPro has kind of been a mess. But either way, whichever one you choose, I think you're not necessarily gonna have a bad time. They both deliver pretty well. So if you want to pick one of these up, I'll leave links to both options down below. But let me know which one you think did best, because they're getting pretty close.